welcome to the next in our Pakistan at 100 podcast series. I have the great honor and pleasure of being joined by Sohail Jehangir Malik Sahab. Malik Sahab is an educationist, an academic who has written over 100 articles in reports that have been published in leading outlets around the world. He has taught at places as diverse as Johns Hopkins University and has served as the HEC Chair of Economics at both Faisalabad and Sargodha universities. He's the author of 3 books and has edited 4 others, including, in my mind, the go-to text on agriculture today in Pakistan, agriculture and the rural economy in Pakistan. He's also the author of the 1987 National Agriculture Commission report. Sohail Sahab, thank you so much for joining us. Agriculture is important to our economy for various reasons. One is that it's historically has been the backbone of the economy. For many years, it had disproportionate size to play in our national income numbers. It also has serious growth potential, in no small part because we haven't harnessed it to the extent possible. At the same time, it doesn't just serve an economic or a growth function. It also is important for us to include the poor in growth, simply because 76% of our poor population lives in rural areas. Can you just start by laying out for us some of the most important issues that are constraining us and have brought us to where we are in the agriculture sector today?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honored. It's very sad, as you mentioned, the share of agriculture in Pakistan's GDP was over 60% when we started. According to official estimates, it's now less than 20. This structural transformation is natural. It's a process of development. But unfortunately, in Pakistan, the proportion of labor employed in the sector has not declined as much. So, according to current estimates, 42% of our labor is dependent now on less than 20% of GDP. There is widespread and increasing poverty, and most of this poverty is located in the rural areas. Unfortunately, our research and our policy making has not taken cognizance of the changing structure of the rural sector and the rural economy, and especially agriculture. What's happened is that if you look at the 1960 agriculture census, less than 19% of all operated holdings were under 5 acres. In the 2010 census, 67% of all holdings are under 5 acres. The average farm size is 3 acres, and this varies. Now, to put a perspective on this varies across regions. And aggregates, averages of this type tend to mask a huge variability because 3 acres in a highly productive area may be sufficient to just meet the bare nutritional requirements of the farm family. Farm sizes, because of population pressure, have increased. The population pressure on land has more than quadrupled in the last 20 years. So what's happened is it takes on an average 1.4 acres of land committed to wheat production at the national average to meet just the nutrition requirement of a family of 6.2. So the farm family then has to find the resources for all its other needs from within this. And like I said, these averages mask huge variations. So the majority of them are on the left-hand side of the distribution.
So isn't that something, the decrease in farm size seems to be because as time passes and population grows, two brothers will inherit what their father had, and so clearly it has to be half the area that you're on. And so this would be something you'd imagine happens in most countries. So my question, I have two questions. One is, what is the problem for farmers when they have a smaller farm? And second, how have other countries circumnavigated this problem?
Yeah. It's not generalizable to say. What happens in other countries is that the land market functions. So people have the option of actually selling their land and moving on, and they have other sources of income. In Pakistan, unfortunately, the land market does not function. It's largely the result of a centuries-old but British enforced rule, which is called the Haqq-e-Shufa, which means that the neighbor has the first right of purchase. So the subdivided property, when it comes up for sale, that sale is blocked by the neighbor. 90% of all civil litigation in Pakistan's courts pertain to land-related issues. So now let me come back to the second question. How do people cope with small farm sizes? The other characteristic of agriculture in Pakistan, which we have not really understood fully, is that our policies and the inadequate development of markets has forced the economy into 4 major crops. And they are heavily promoted for several reasons by policy and support. And more recently, a 5th crop has come in, maize. But of these 4 crops that we talk about, our yields have been stagnant and even declining. And they are only a fraction of the yields, for example, in the neighboring Punjab.
In India.
In India. Unfortunately, the difference between average yields and best practice yields, and then between best practice yields and what you get at research stations, is, for example, for wheat, is in the ratio of 1:3. So if we were at the frontiers of this production frontier, and we can go into the reasons why this didn't happen, you would get 3 times the yield per acre for wheat.
So you're saying 2 things here. One, the technically possible amount of crop that we can harvest given our agroclimate, our agroclimatic conditions, is at some level. Then we have some decrease that happens when you go from the lab or the experimental farm to a farm run by a business here in Pakistan, whatever the conditions are. And there's a large gap also between the farmers that are able to achieve the highest yields and the ones that are at a lower level. And so what would be some causes that cause that gap?
2 or 3. One, policy and limitations, for example, in implementation, the transfer of technology and knowledge has been such, and it's severely constrained by the lack of capacity. And capacity, by the way, is an underlying factor across the board, but we'll talk about the capacity in extension right now. So you will be astonished that there is one extension officer for 10,000 farms. Now, this means that this man has to provide technology and information for 10,000 farmers that he's responsible for, and he is not a specialist. He's supposed to provide information and extension services for all types of crops. Increasingly, agriculture now is a very scientific, very balanced. So we have huge issues with the fact that the adoption of even fertilizer and the proper balancing, testing, quality of seed, where it comes from, assurances, etc. So what this extension agent officer does, he chooses a few selected politically powerful farmers. They become, in inverted commas, the progressive farmers. So all the resources in terms of laser leveling of land, consolidation, application, best varieties, seed control.
Whatever the state subsidizes.
They benefit from much more. And their production is higher. And those are the people that, whenever there is an inspection or whatever, are visited, and the rest of the farmers. One other thing with the small sizes that we talked about and we haven't really paid attention to is fragmentation. As these things get subdivided, that average 3 acres is not one contiguous plot anymore. So you've got a postage stamp size piece in one corner and then another one somewhere else and another. The third thing is, because of that, management and costs, etc., efficiency for the small farmer becomes a big issue. And associated with that is the fact that there has been severe land degradation over time. So we're losing land productivity because of inadequate attention to how proper crop husbandry, etc. I'm sorry I'm going on and on, but I want to add one more thing before you ask me that next question. This very small farmer doesn't diversify, and you ask the question why. There's 2 reasons. His poverty currently, and we have information in that book you mentioned, that shows that wheat provides the cheapest calories per rupee. So, and it fills the belly. When you talk to really poor people that, for example, have chicken, and you say, why don't you feed these eggs? Female malnutrition is a huge problem. So is child malnutrition. The women will tell you that this egg doesn't fill the belly, but I can sell the egg to get some flour and maybe some onions and something else, and that because of its bulk provides us with the capacity to fill our bellies, and that is one of the reasons. It's also patterns have changed so much. The highest expenditure per family, even in the poorest, is on sugar in the household income expenditure service, and on ghee, and then wheat, like I mentioned. So no policy or analysis is really looking at these factors and why behavior is the way it is, and it needs to be accounted for in policy. Also, in Pakistan, and we can talk about the policy inadequacies, but we've pursued one policy fits all. And there are huge variations across regions, zones, etc.
You have a fantastic description in the book about the different agroclimatic zones, and it was enlightening for me because you think of the map, you think of provinces, you don't really think of dividing the province up into what clearly should be the case, into different regions that are better at growing certain types of things. You also mentioned the sort of how the poor behave, and that's a huge topic of debate. I want to get to that later, but I want to stick first to how to get more output from the land, right? And so you talked about the fragmentation of land. Now, my understanding is that there are certain types of cropping patterns that are actually fairly suitable for small pieces of land. I'm thinking of drip irrigation, I'm thinking of tunnel farming, these things. So you actually need relatively, or you can't really scale up too much because you need to have individuals that are spending a lot of time at each plant and so on. But just for the viewer to get a sense of the scale of the problem, can you tell us sort of what in other countries that are producing more is the average size of farm that's considered feasible? And it seems to me that it's growing, and you can confirm whether it is or not. And what again the average size here is?
In Pakistan, we have some of the most productive land in the world. The big issue and the sad issue is this overwhelming level of poverty which restricts the ability of the farmer to take any risks. That's one.
Okay.
Two, inadequate access to markets on both sides, on the output side, but more so on the input side. And we have subsidized agriculture and rural credit for decades. And in 2000, I wrote a book that was published by PIDE on the rural credit market and poverty in Pakistan. Unfortunately, this is now 18 years down, and my first job was to write the Rural Credit Survey report for 1974. The issues have remained the same. If you look at the State Bank Bulletin, this is going to shock you now. For 2016, you find that 70% of their total credit dispersed went to 4 districts. 70%. But this is not so shocking. Non-farm credit, which is required to add value to this production, and I want to go into the changing structure because now, more and more as this land fragmentation and division has taken place, a larger proportion of the what were people dependent on land have now become non-farm. So 60% of your rural sector is now non-farm.
That's actually something that people living in cities probably don't realize. 60%, let me reiterate, 60%
no direct connection to land.
Of the rural population has no direct contact with agriculture, with farming.
Yes, unfortunately. And very little other employment opportunities because, and by the way, this is circular because if there was processing of this agricultural produce, even if there was basic aggregation, because this is now very small, the output is very small, and most agricultural output, if it is not grains, is perishable. So, once they produce it, they have to sell it very quickly. So, there is no aggregating mechanism, so they are price takers. Very small production. They can't take the risk. They're already very poor, and they have no other means. So, the non-farm sector also adds to this, increasing complication. So, inadequate access to markets, as I mentioned, in terms of the small production, the inability in Pakistan, there is no sorting, grading of produce, etc., or packaging. And where it has occurred, there are huge success stories. The region around Sargodha, where I taught about 10 years ago, became one of the world's leaders in the export of kinu. And this was all done in private enterprise by very small producers, and the total cost of setting up one of these at that stage, sorting and polishing and waxing locally manufactured machines was 14 lakh rupees.
Really?
Only.
That's a small amount.
And they got together. They were exporting kinus all the way from Moscow in Russia to the Far East. There was no issue at all.
What triggered that change?
Yes. What triggered the change was a few enterprising people. It's the same with the tunnel farming you mentioned. One bright gentleman went to Holland to study, wasn't successful in the study. He might object to that. He's a very important man now. But he went to work in a greenhouse. And he learnt about tunnel farming. He came back and he employed it in his dad's farm here, and that replicated. The problem with those techniques is they are capital intensive as far as the poor small farmer is concerned. It takes about ₹1 lakh to put a small tunnel. And you need that market, the very well-developed market to get the output quickly into the right place so that it doesn't perish. But it adds enormous value. We did a series of studies, by the way, and they're published on tunnel farming and vegetable and the kinu, for example. We also did a fantastic study on the milk revolution, and that's the other thing we should talk about because part of agriculture is also livestock production.
So isn't this a chicken and egg problem though? Because let's imagine that there's an enterprising but relatively small farmer. He sets up one tunnel farm in the middle of nowhere, produces great vegetables, and when he takes them to market, he's the only seller there, which means he doesn't get a good price for his produce,
Absolutely.
he isn't able to get it to places of the high end of the value chain.
No.
And so, does this mean that you either need to have a sort of large-scale investment by either richer farmers, or do you need some sort of state coordination? What's the resolution on this problem?
Well, you were part of the team that worked on the agriculture policy for Punjab. Our recommendation was to scrap the existing agriculture market ordinance. You know, if you were to ask me, excuse me, that is one of the biggest constraints to the development of agriculture in Pakistan, because it's almost like a turnpike. It controls, by law, you cannot set up a wholesale market without all those permissions, and you might be fascinated by this. You have to be the son of an Aarti to be an Aarti in Pakistan. That law still exists. But what happens is that it restricts the ability of this small farmer that you mentioned to get the value for his product. What the tunnel farming does is it increases, it moves the timing of entry into the market. So you can enter the market either early or late, so you catch the peaks. And some of the analysis that we have, and this is fascinating for that agriculture policy report, unfortunately, most of that type of work didn't get in the final approved version. Price differentials are enormous, and across months, and then even within the same month across markets. We showed 25, 30%, 40% margins in the same month for the same product.
That's really interesting. So, when I've had the chance to live abroad in developed countries where they're getting imports from all over the world, you see actually very little variability of prices throughout the year, presumably either because they're sourcing from other places at different times of the year, but also because they're storing well. And what you're saying is, essentially in a market where there's no storage, you have times when you've got a lot of produce that you can only sell. Let's imagine that you have a surplus of food today. You have to sell it today, otherwise it perishes. And the guy who buys it from you can't store it. He has to sell to the end consumer at low prices, and often you'll see these people throwing fresh produce on the side of the road when they can't sell it. And then the next day or the next month, that crop, that harvest has disappeared, and so you're now in a scarce situation, and prices have shot up, and people are going relatively hungry. And so what you're saying is, for tunnel farming, you're either harvest earlier or later than, because you're not as dependent on the climate that you're seeing.
But you nailed it when you said that there's only this one farmer. And he can't influence the market, so right. you need to have a system that actually encourages this across the board,
right.
And a market that appreciates this value. Otherwise, I don't know if people who are really aware, and most urban people have lost this interest and don't understand. I tried to be a small tenant farmer as an experiment. I live in a village outside of Hasanain, which is very productive, nice land. So I rented 10 acres of land, and we grew cauliflower. And it was organic. And best practice, we got wonderful yields. There were at that time only 1 or 2 stores in Islamabad. So I approached them and I said, I have this organic, and you can certify it. I can get you results that show no pesticide, no. I would like you to purchase this. They were selling organic. And they said, no, we're not interested. And then one of the people that worked at the store had known me for 30, 40 years. So I asked him, what's going on? They should be jumping at this. I'm selling it. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. We take the inorganic one and we put it here and say it's organic. How do you know? But that's only one part of it. That cauliflower I'm talking about, my people took it to the Islamabad market early in the morning in a big shazor full of cauliflower. We got 2 rupees and 50 paisas per kilogram. Take it or leave it. So we took it. And the same man actually also purchases for my household. That afternoon, he brought cauliflower from our neighboring market at 28 rupees per kilogram. That's the markup. That's what this small farmer, now, we were bigger farmers or whatever, he's not even able to get to the Islamabad market.
So I want to understand something here, which is, and this is something that's puzzled me. Economists think that middlemen are good because what a middleman's job is to do is to coordinate with the farmer who can't go and find the person who wants to eat his produce, take it from the farmer, go and take the risk of buying in the hope of finding someone to sell to, and then find the appropriate person to sell to. And this is a valuable function. When we don't have it, in fact, you get a disconnect essentially between the producer and the consumer. And so you need middlemen, and around the world there are conditions in which demonstrably middlemen have improved markets. But Aartis or middlemen here have a really bad rap. And you sort of suggested an answer, which is that there is some sort of blockage for new entrants in the market. Yep. Is that what it is?
Well, yes, and this is fantastic for your students. When you apply neoclassical methods of analysis, look at the assumptions underlying the model. Neoclassical economics says free entry and exit to market.
Yes.
Okay, and you maximize prices come down because people take advantage of the information asymmetries and they correct for them and the market functions. In Pakistan, there are systems that prevent that from happening. And the rent-seeking behavior is so strong that it is almost impossible to counter them. And this goes across the board. And the sad thing is that the 67% of all farms that are the real agriculture of this country, I'll tell you some horrific stories in a second, are totally prevented from taking advantage of this. Now, I want to give you another fact that might startle all of you. For our work for this agriculture policy, we estimated that the average subsidy per farm household in Pakistan, in Punjab, was $150. And this is the subsidy on wheat, on fertilizers, and even the water abhyana is not counted. Yes. But now let me tell you, only 26% of all wheat producers in Pakistan are net sellers. Did you know that? So even if I produce wheat, I'm a small farmer and I sell it and I get this subsidy, I go back to the market for this atta and I buy it at a higher price. So I don't benefit unless I am a net seller. And those 26% who are net sellers are the people that sit in your assemblies and elsewhere to take advantage of this. Similarly with fertilizer. Okay, there are two other things I want to bring in very quickly because this just adds flavor to why these differences I talked about also work between farms that are located in irrigated areas between head, middle and tail. Okay, the tail end is the most disadvantaged, not in terms of just water but also in fertilizer is heavily subsidized. You know why? Because the fertilizer industry is owned largely by the army and by two other families that have determined the policy of the economic policy of this country. Gas is subsidized. Okay, we produce only nitrogenous fertilizer. We need a balance of N, P, and K.
So for the audience, can you describe what those are?
Potassium but because the soil basically deficiency varies across regions. Nitrogen is very good. But it's now determined that overuse of nitrogen suddenly adds a lot of greenery to the vegetation. So you look, but it doesn't add to the productivity. We've reached a stage where there are now declining returns to scale on the existing fertilizer use because what our farmers do not know how to balance the thing. They just buy these bags that are sold to them by these two large vendors and they're just cast. Also, the people that use the larger amount of fertilizer are getting a larger proportion of that subsidy, so you know where it's going to, and it's the unequal distribution of land. What I also didn't mention is the huge disparity across regions. So you start with the Barani areas, they have no water, they have a different type, they have a different comparative advantage also. We've never taken advantage of it, but they're now so poor that you can't ask them to start a vineyard, for example, grow grapes which are very productive, or olives which are very productive. On grapes, I have to tell you a story, and this might excite your students. The government of Punjab pushed out, grape cultivation in a big way. And they gave lots of concessions to these large farmers. So we did these roundtables for the policy, and the grape growers came and they collected in Pindi. They were very upset. So I said, what happened? You got all these concessions. He said, that's all right. But the grapes they gave us to grow are wine grapes. They are not table grapes. Islamic Republic of Pakistan. This is a true story. So it highlights the disconnect between policy, because there's no analysis, there's no data. And by the way, for anything to be replicated, your professor's questions earlier, you need to have evaluative data that tells you what can be upscaled and what can be replicated, so you move in a pattern that's taking advantage of the best that's available. So
there are lots of topics to touch upon, and we're actually close to the end of this, unfortunately. There's the issue of seeds, where at the time that a farmer goes, in fact, I think one of when I think of the farmer's problems, one of his problems is that any input that he buys, he can't actually tell whether it's good quality or bad quality at that time. So this is what economists call experience goods. But it gets worse, because for some types of experience goods, you actually figure out the quality later. For the farmer, he takes some seed and some fertilizer and applies certain amounts of water and has certain weather and has pest attacks. And all of that mix then gives him his only indicator, which is average yields. And so is there any way out of, besides having a good quality accreditation from the government, is there any way out where we can improve the input market?
Yes. And that also is connected to regulation and reform. But I think that it's a very important area. It is possible with modern technology to test for the percentage of germination in any batch of seeds before they enter the market. Okay. And these are large germinators, seed testing equipment, which is not very expensive. Maybe expensive, but it's, they set up commercially. They can actually force the production of the sprouting of the seed, etc., and then count the proportion of seed that has come up and certify batches. About, I think 30 years ago, I was driving past a bakery in Islamabad that was selling patties. And since I love to eat, I walked in. They were using a large germinator that had been donated by the USAID to the government of Pakistan for keeping the patties warm. Because what the germinator does is it increases the temperature, but it also introduces controlled humidity. So if these guys were just heating this up with lights, traditionally their patties would go hard, and they wanted them at the right somehow. So I got into conversation with him, and I said, this is a brilliant idea. And he said to me, if you need some, I know somebody, they are just lying there useless, and if you go and bribe them, they'll just give it to you. So I went looking, and I found a few hundred of these germinators in the Federal Seed Certification Department that had not been used, that were just lying unused. So that is one of the other reasons for the inadequate monitoring, evaluation, etc. There's no control, no accountability. So it's a very complex situation, and you're looking at agriculture, which most planners and policymakers in Pakistan do not even consider to be essential. And I want to leave you with this thought since your time is running out, if you don't have productivity and production in the commodity producing sectors of Pakistan, this imaginary growth coming from services in a system which is comprising of a majority of people that are not educated and have no skills is illusionary. Go check the numbers. I beg you as young students, decompose the growth of the service sector and tell me where it's coming from, and then ask the Federal Bureau of Statistics what the basis is for these different sectors. You'll find that at least 18% of it comes from guesstimates. There is no basis. And for the others, it's coming from insurance, from banking, huge profits. Tell me how many Pakistanis living in rural Pakistan have the skills to go into insurance and banking or even the education. So if you assume that this trickle down is going to get down to them, then these rich people in the insurance and banking sector, and all of you, if you're LUMS graduates, will get this job. Look at your consumption patterns. How much of your consumption is coming from rural Pakistan? Yep. So you need those linkages, and for that you need conscious policy. And I think you're in the right direction. You should promote as much awareness of these policy issues as you can.
So last question, and the tragedy here is with this series that every time we have a conversation with anyone on any topic, you can't even graze the surface. So there's lots of things such as credit that we haven't talked about. We're thinking in this project about Pakistan's future out till 2047, when Pakistan is 100 years old. What would be the, let's say, top 2 or 3 things that you think, given our political economy today, given that we have a government that can be both dysfunctional and corrupt at times, what are the 2 or 3 things that we can get most traction on that would be most beneficial to the agriculture of the country?
I think the only way, I think, right now for our economy is to be able to employ this large group of semi-educated but unemployed people. If you look at your demographic pyramid, it's a demographic death trap. And they're now getting into the multiplication stage, so it's going to really alter the impact, and without any real, but use them, do a little bit of, I'm trying to push this very hard, and it's one of my pet things, social engineering. Liberate, shortcut the inadequacies, inefficiencies in the market, make information more widely available, and let them pool resources to be able to take, for example, these small amounts of produce across the village into bulk and then market them directly to the consumer through groups that are set up across the board of these young people in cities and in diverse areas. Let me also tell you 2 things, and that's just a comparative advantage. There is a huge deficit of vegetables and agricultural produce that's required in the Middle East. It comes from Europe and other places, that those markets are easily accessible from here. And we talk about being the 4th largest producer of milk, and we can talk about that later. But we're sitting on the edge of one of the largest milk deficient regions in the world, all the way to the Far East. They're deficient in milk. They desperately need milk, and they buy very expensive. So there are ways in which you can do that. That study that I talked to you about, livestock, was an analysis of the Idara-e-Kisan, which was set up as a cooperative of women livestock owners. A gentleman that pushed this very hard was Zafar Altaf, and unfortunately he's dead. But massive, large business interests soon took care of that. And that entire experiment, which was very successful, they had 80,000 cooperative members. Is now almost dead. Halib, I don't know if you remember the product. So the 2 things I would ask for: 1, voice and analysis and awareness. correct those information asymmetries, build as much information out there that people cannot take perverse decisions, and inform the producers and include those poor in the process. There is very detailed data now available on the proportion of poor within almost every category of farm households. Also, their sources of income. There is no household now that is totally reliant on agriculture, especially in the small farms, because they have to diversify sources. So they are going and doing all sorts of other things and not just specializing in agriculture. But if you look at those income sources, that's the other way to look at social engineering, but bring science into it. And you know why this is broken down? Because that voice normally translates in other countries through political processes into legislation and regulation that informs science and the development of research, etc. That then leads to the correction of these things. In Pakistan, each one of the things that I have spoken to you is mentioned in detail in that National Agriculture Commission report of 1987. I had the privilege of working on that, but it also gave me insight into the agriculture sector and the sadness that despite 30 years, and I've been doing this, most of these papers that he spoke about are concerned with these issues. Access to agriculture credit, access to markets, poverty. Most of my work is on rural poverty. Poverty dynamics, which is the other very, there are aspects of that if adjusted for can help so much in the development process. So,
thank you. Thank you very much. This was enlightening and I hope inspiring to a lot of these the younger generation that needs to learn about agriculture. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored.